1470. High in the mountains of Thessaly, a single bell tolls its last breath across a valley that will soon forget its sound. And inside the stone heart of street, Catherine's convent, 23 women are on their knees, their lips moving together in a silent, practiced rhythm, whispering prayers they've known their whole lives. But today, the words catch in their throats, tasting of ash and final goodbyes. Beyond their walls, the sky is bleeding a deep, unnatural crimson, and it isn't the dawn. It's the color of empire, an empire that has already devoured kingdoms. The Ottoman army, it doesn't just march. It's a current of steel and flame, scouring the land clean. And at the heart of the convent stands Sister Eleni, the abbess, holding a silver crucifix, a relic that has seen 3 generations of faith. Her hands shake, but it isn't fear you see in them. It's resolve. She knows what's coming. They all do. But what they can't possibly fathom, what no one could ever imagine, is that a quick end would have been a gift. You see, the story of what happened next, it's not in the textbooks. It was deliberately buried, erased, smothered under centuries of silence. And what the Ottomans did to these women was so much more than conquest. It was something cold, something meticulous, something that we're only now piecing together from the shadows. So the real question isn't if you can stomach the truth. It's if you have the courage to help us remember it. If you've ever looked at a history book and felt like pages were missing, like some stories just disappeared, then you've found the right place. Here at Crimson Historians, we're the ones digging through the dust, through the archives the world chose to forget. We're reading the forgotten missionary letters, the official Ottoman records, the sworn testimonies sealed away in Vatican vaults. And honestly, every view, every single subscription, it helps us drag one more of these lost voices back into the light. Now, let's get back to that convent. The bell is silent, and the doors are splintering. To really understand what was about to happen to these nuns, you have to understand the machine that was coming to devour them. Just 17 years before, in 1453, the unthinkable happened. Constantinople fell. The radiant jewel of the Christian world, a city that had stood defiant for more than 1,000 years, was broken, gone. In 53 days of unrelenting cannon fire and rivers of blood, the Hagia Sophia, the greatest cathedral on earth, was stripped bare of its crosses within hours. Its golden mosaics plastered into darkness, its ancient bells melted into silence. And in less than a week, the call to prayer was echoing from the very domes that had heard Christian hymns for 900 years. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror, stood in the heart of that sacred space and declared it a mosque. And he didn't do it because he needed a new place to pray. He did it because he understood a secret that most conquerors miss. You don't truly break a people by killing them. You break them by erasing them, by wiping away who they ever were. The Ottomans weren't just conquering land, they were conquering memory itself. He saw these lingering wounds on the landscape that just refused to heal. Every church bell that dared to ring. Every monastery that still clung to a mountainside. Every cross that cast a defiant shadow on his soil. These weren't just buildings. They were proof that the old world was refusing to die, and every nun, whispering her prayers in a language he had conquered, was a living, breathing testament that faith could outlast an army. So, the Sultan made a new policy. If they will not bend, they will simply vanish. But not with a massacre. That's too messy. A massacre creates martyrs. Martyrs fuel resistance. Songs get written. Legends are born. The dead become more powerful than the living. No. The Ottomans had refined a method far more elegant. A method that left no songs to be sung, no stories to be told, and soon, no memory at all. Erasure. By 1470, this chilling strategy had been field-tested all across the new empire. On Greek monasteries in Morea, Serbian convents in the Balkans, Armenian churches deep in Anatolia. They didn't just burn them all down. Some were converted, others were simply left to crumble into dust. But the pattern, my friends, was always the same. First, the offer, then the silence. And the convent of Street, Catherine, isolated on a lonely hill in Thessaly, with no army or allies to call upon, was about to become the next experiment. Just another footnote in the grand story of an empire's march. But these women, they didn't know they were footnotes. They weren't soldiers. They were quiet women who had dedicated their entire existence to silence and prayer, whose only weapons were the beads of a rosary slipping through their fingers. Their only armor was faith. Most of them had never even seen a soldier up close, never felt the cold weight of a blade, never dreamed a day would come when they'd need to. Sister Eleni, their abbess for 12 years, had come here after tending to the sick in a village that doesn't even exist anymore, a place completely wiped out by the plague back in 1448. She hadn't come here to run from the world, but to try and find some meaning in it. Then there was Sister Magdalena, just 19 years old. She'd only taken her vows 2 years ago, and her hands were still rough with the calluses from her father's farm. She'd sought refuge here after a raid took her entire family. This convent was the only home where she'd ever felt safe again. And Sister Theodoros, she was 70. She had already outlived 2 abbesses, an emperor, and more wars than any person should have to count. Death had stopped being something she feared decades ago. But this was something new. And if this moment, this convergence of faith and force, doesn't stir something in you, then you might be ignoring the very lesson our ancestors died to pass on. That the ultimate act of rebellion in the face of overwhelming power is to simply refuse to forget who you are. Now, let's see what happens when faith stands in the path of an empire. The first cannonball hits at dawn. It misses the chapel. It hits the bell tower. The sound is the end of the world. Stone vaporizes. Iron screams. The bell, the very same bell that had called this valley to prayer every morning for 140 years, shatters in midair. Its broken pieces rain down like shrapnel into the little garden where the sisters grew their healing herb. And the same hands that so gently tended those plants are now clamped over their ears, shaking. But Sister Eleni, she doesn't scream. She just stands there, raises her crucifix to the sky, and begins to sing, Kyrie eleison asterisk, Lord, have mercy. And one by one, the others join her song. 23 lone voices, rising like smoke against the thunder of an empire. But empires, you see, have no ears for music. By noon, the gates are nothing but splinters. Ottoman soldiers flood the courtyard, but they're not holding swords, they're holding ledgers, quills, ink pots. They move through the holy grounds like accountants, not warriors, counting, recording, cataloging every last thing. Because in the eyes of this empire, these women aren't souls, they're assets. And then a translator steps out from the ranks. A local man, a Greek who knew these very hills. His voice trembles as he unrolls a scroll, and you can almost hear the shame cracking in every syllable he speaks. By the decree of Sultan Mehmed II, all subjects in these conquered lands must now submit to the authority of the Sublime Porte. Those who accept the true faith will be given protection. Those who refuse will suffer the consequences of their rebellion. Sister Eleni moves forward. Her face is a mask of perfect, calm, almost peaceful. She doesn't even look at the soldiers. She speaks directly to the translator, in Greek, so pure and strong that every man there understands her. You can tell your sultan that we have already pledged our lives to a king. We have nothing left for him to take. The officer in charge just stares. And this man, Hasan Pasha, a name that echoes in Ottoman military records from the 1470s Thessalian campaign, he doesn't lash out in anger. No, he answers with something that sends a colder shiver down your spine. A smile. Because you see, he knows a secret the nuns haven't yet begun to comprehend. The Ottomans had turned breaking a person, without ever laying a hand on them, into a chilling art form. That night, the women are sealed inside their own chapel. No food, no water, only a suffocating darkness and the distant sounds of soldiers just outside the walls, their laughter and life. A cruel counterpoint to the silence within, a waiting game to see who would crack first. 2 sisters, just girls really, from Corinth. Their resolve finally crumbles and they begin to weep in a corner, their quiet sobs ricocheting off the cold stone. But then Sister Magdalena, barely 20 years old, starts to whisper a psalm, a thread of sound in the dark, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." And then another follows, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." And another, and slowly, miraculously, the weeping stops. And this, right here, was the moment the Ottomans profoundly underestimated them. These weren't ordinary women. They had spent their entire existence in a state of preparation for this very kind of suffering, through endless fasting, through vigils in the biting cold, through vows of silence, and the complete submission of their will to something they believed was infinitely greater than themselves. What the soldiers saw as a new and terrible torture, the nuns simply recognized as a Tuesday. But Hasan Pasha, he is a patient man. He's seen this kind of faith before. In Morea, in Wallachia, in the skeletal ruins of Serbian monasteries where defiant monks truly believed their faith was a shield. Faith, he once penned in a letter to the Sultan, a letter that you can still find tucked away in the Topkapi Palace archives, is like a candle. It always burns the brightest right before it's extinguished. And now he was about to put that little theory to the test. On the second day, the doors creak open. A servant walks in, carrying bread and water. Real bread, clean water. He places it on the floor without a single word and is gone. The nuns just stare at it. You can imagine their throats, parched and raw, their stomachs aching with a deep, hollow emptiness. The younger sisters turn their gaze to Eleni, a desperate plea swimming in their eyes. Sister Theodora, the eldest of them all, is the first to speak, her voice a dry rasp. They want us to take it. They want us to feel a flicker of gratitude, to soften our resolve. Eleni simply nods. Then we fast. They don't touch the food. By the third day, their lips are cracked, flecked with blood. Their hands tremble. The youngest among them can barely find the strength to stand, but not a single one of them breaks. Hassan Pasha watches all of this unfold from the courtyard, his arms crossed over his chest. He's impressed. You can see it. He's frustrated. And maybe, just for a fleeting second, something that looks dangerously close to respect flickers across his hardened face. No stories to be told, and soon, no memory at all. Erasure. By 1470, this chilling strategy had been field-tested all across the new empire. On Greek monasteries in Morea, Serbian convents in the Balkans, Armenian churches deep in Anatolia. They didn't just burn them all down. Some were converted. You are simply mistaken. The Sultan is a merciful man. He offers you new lives, new names, his protection. All you have to do is say the words. The silence that answers him is absolute. Or, he continues, you can come with us to Constantinople. There, the Sultan himself will hear your case. Real bread, clean water. He places it on the floor without a single word and is gone. The nuns just stare at it. You can imagine their throats, parched and raw, their stomachs aching with a deep, hollow emptiness. The younger sisters turn their gaze to Eleni, a desperate plea swimming in their eyes. Sister Theodora, the eldest of them all, but respect doesn't win wars. On the third day, the doors open again. This time, it's not a servant. It's Hassan himself, with a translator trailing him like a ghost. He speaks in Turkish, his voice calm, reasonable. You are not criminals. You are not our enemies. That night, they huddle together in the oppressive dark. No one speaks, but then Sister Magdalena starts to hum, a familiar hymn they always sang at Vespers. And one by one, the other voices join hers, fragile but unbroken. Outside, the soldiers hear it. A few of them stop what they're doing. Some of them look away, unable to watch. One of them, years and years from now, will tell his grandson about the strange women who sang themselves to death. But that story, like so many others, will be lost to the winds of time. For now, the hymn just rises, seeping through the cracks in the chapel walls and drifting out into the vast, indifferent night. It was a prayer, a plea, a declaration. We are still here. They leave at dawn on the fourth day. 23 women, their hands bound with rough rope, beginning a long walk south toward the coast. No carts, no horses for them, just their own 2 feet, the choking dust, and a sun that offered no mercy. The soldiers don't rush them. They don't have to. The road itself is the instrument of their punishment. By the second day, Sister Irene collapses. She's 62 years old. Her knees had been failing her for years. She fights to stand, but her legs just refuse to obey. The soldiers don't even pause. So Sister Magdalena and another nun, Sister Anna, they lift her between them, carrying her dead weight for the next 3 miles. When they finally stop for the night, Irene is unconscious. By morning, she's gone. They bury her on the side of the road, scooping out the earth with their bare hands. No tools, no ceremony, just handfuls of dirt and whispered prayers. The soldiers watch. They don't interfere. Hassan Pasha just makes a small note in his ledger. 22 remaining. On the fourth day, it happens again. Sister Callista, a woman who hadn't uttered a word since the siege began, she just stops walking. She sits down right in the middle of the road, closes her eyes, and refuses to get up. They just leave her there. By the time they finally limp into the port of Volo 7 days later, only 18 of them are left. But something had happened out there on that road. Something the Ottomans had never planned for. The nuns had stopped weeping. They had stopped begging. They walked in a profound silence. But it wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence of women who had looked into the abyss and had already made their choice. Sister Eleni had been walking at the very front of the line, a silent leader even with her hands bound. But on the morning of the 7th day, Hassan Pasha calls for her. She's brought to his tent alone. And what happens next? Well, you won't find it in any Ottoman record. The official story goes silent here. Instead, it's described in a letter from a Venetian merchant who saw what happened after, a letter that was lost for centuries, only to be rediscovered in 2003 in the archives of Dubrovnik. He writes, "I saw them bring her back at dawn. She could not walk. Her eyes, God forgive me, her eyes were wide open, but she was no longer inside them. They dressed her in fine silk and paraded her through the camp, a new convert for all to see. But when I passed close to her," he wrote, "I could see her lips moving. She was still praying, silently, in Latin. She hadn't broken. They had simply taken her body and left her soul behind to wander." And this, my friends, is the Ottoman strategy that history class never teaches you. They didn't want martyrs. Martyrs create legends. Martyrs inspire resistance. Songs are written about them. Stories are told, and the dead are turned into saints. No, they wanted ghosts. Women who would walk and talk and eat and breathe, but who would never, ever be whole again. They were to be living proof that rebellion was pointless. Walking, breathing warnings to anyone who dared to think that their faith could ever stand against an empire. Sister Eleni walked with them the rest of the way to the coast, but she never spoke again. She never looked another person in the eye. She was there, but she wasn't. The younger sisters wept when they saw the emptiness in her. The older ones just held their beads tighter and prayed harder. At the port of Volos, they are herded onto a galley. A massive, brutal warship, with rows of benches and heavy chains bolted directly to the wood. This is no passenger ship. This is a machine, a vessel, designed for one thing: control, slaves, prisoners, cargo. The nuns are chained to the benches, their wrists locked into cold iron rings. A ship's manifest, discovered in 1987 in Istanbul's Topkapi Palace Museum, lists them not by name, but by a number. Religious captives, female, 18 of them. Their destination, the imperial household, and their purpose: domestic service and conversion. You and I both know that word service is hiding a world of hurt. The journey across the sea takes 12 long days, and the sea is anything but kind. Storms just hammer the deck. Salt spray feels like acid on their cracked lips. The whole world pitches and rolls with the ship, and these women, who've never even seen the ocean before, they're sick until there's absolutely nothing left inside them. And at night, it's the youngest one, a girl named Sister Magdalena, who whispers psalms just under her breath. Her voice is just a thread, almost lost in the roar of the waves, but somehow, the other prisoners, Greeks, Serbs, Italians, men and women alike, all chained right there beside them, they turn their heads, straining to listen. And just for a breath, for one impossible moment, it feels like the sea itself holds its breath to hear. When their ship finally glides into the Bosphorus, the sisters look up and see the skyline of Constantinople rising like a dream before them. Domes and minarets piercing the sky, walls that look like they could go on forever. The whole city just gleams in the dawnlight, sharp and beautiful and dangerous, like the edge of a blade. For centuries, this city, once whispered to be the world's greatest desire, was now destined to become their cage. From the docks, their procession began a slow march through narrow streets, a world of merchants, soldiers, and the haunted eyes of the enslaved. People just stopped and stared. Because seeing Christian nuns in a line of captives, that was a rare sight, even for an empire practically built on conquest. This was something different. They marched past the ancient walls, led through the imperial district, past lush gardens where fountains sang and peacocks screamed their strange, lonely cries, and then, standing in the immense shadow of the Hagia Sophia, that great, soaring church that was now a mosque, they are forced to a stop, forced to their knees. And as the call to prayer echoes out from the minarets, a sound both beautiful and foreign, one of the sisters whispers, "We are home, but it is no longer ours." Then they are taken to the palace. This city, once whispered to be the world's greatest desire, was now destined to become their cage. From the docks, their procession began a slow march through narrow streets, a world of merchants, soldiers, and the haunted eyes of the enslaved. People just stopped and stared. But not to the grand halls, you might imagine. Not to the sun-drenched courtyards where ambassadors would walk and viziers would whisper their conspiracies. No, they are taken down spiraling stone steps into a waiting darkness, through tunnels thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, to a place that, on any official map, simply did not exist. Let's follow their footsteps down into that darkness. Deep beneath the Topkapi Palace, there's a whole labyrinth of tunnels tourists will never, ever see. Just storage rooms, cramped servant quarters, forgotten corridors that snake through the bedrock like dark veins, and hidden away in the farthest, most remote corner. Look, if you're still here with me, it's because some part of you gets it. You know this is a story that has to be told. So, subscribe to Crimson Historians, not for us really, but for them. For all the voices that were swallowed up by the silence. Now, crosses, dozens and dozens of them. Small, crude little things looking like they were carved with fingernails or maybe a sharp piece of broken pottery. And beneath those crosses, etched in Latin, were 4 words. Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. This was their chapel, was a room that had been sealed off for centuries, a room with no official purpose listed anywhere. Then, in 2011, during some restoration work, a team of archaeologists broke through what they thought was a solid wall. And what they found on the other side, it just stopped them in their tracks. Scratched into the stone, so faint you could barely see them, were they would slip away to this forgotten room and they would pray. They had no priest to guide them, no altar to kneel at, not even a Bible to read from. They only had what they could remember. They recited psalms purely from memory, pulling up half-forgotten verses and reshaping them into the very prayers that were keeping them alive. They sang their hymns in whispers so quiet, the stone walls themselves must have strained to hear them. They took communion with tiny pieces of bread, stolen from the kitchens, and sips of water from the palace wells. And they carved their unwavering faith into the cold stone, one painful scratch at a time, believing with all their hearts that no one would ever see it. And Sister Magdalena was there with them, the same young woman who whispered psalms on that storm-tossed ship, the one who had carried Sister Irene when she fell on the road, the one who refused to look away when they brought Sister Eleni back, dressed in silk. She had become their voice in the suffocating dark. The archaeologists. They found her mark too. A tiny bird scratched into a corner of the wall, and beside it 23 lines, one for each sister. But only 11 of those lines were finished. The rest just trailed off into nothing. They used shards of broken pottery to hold their candles. A torn scrap of linen served as their altar cloth. And from a single shard of a shattered mirror, they fashioned a crude, gleaming cross. It was here, in this secret chapel, that they gathered every single night after the palace slept. No loud hymns, no sermons, only whispers. Each woman would kneel and offer a memory. The smell of her home, the sound of her village church bell, the simple warmth of bread fresh from the oven before dawn. These memories, you see, they became their new psalms, tiny, precious offerings to a God they had to believe was still listening, even in the dark. In fact, a Venetian prisoner held for ransom in the palace back in 1478 wrote in his journal about strange voices he heard echoing from beneath the harem. He said it sounded like women singing in Latin to a god that was not the god of this empire. For centuries, historians just wrote it off as a ghost story, as superstition, until the day they found the chapel. But this is the part that just breaks your heart. The crosses suddenly stop. Halfway across the wall, the scratches become frantic, desperate. The lines are carved deeper, as if with a terrible force, a new urgency, and then nothing. We found Ottoman records from 1482 that mention a cleansing of the palace staff under the new sultan. Anyone who was considered unproductive or resistant was simply removed. No details are given, no names, no burial sites, just a single cold line in a ledger, written in perfect Ottoman script, disposed of. The nuns of Street Catherine, they just vanished from history. 18 women who had walked for 7 days through a living hell, who had crossed an entire sea in chains, who had carved their very souls into stone in the pitch black dark, they were just gone. But their chapel, their little room of whispers, remained. Centuries later, a French diplomat in 1712 wrote about a strange rumor he'd heard from the older palace servants. They said that on certain nights, if you stood very still in the lower halls, the air would turn ice cold, and if you listened with all your might, you could just barely hear women singing in Latin. Of course, he dismissed it as superstition, just the foolish stories of uneducated servants. But you see, the walls don't lie. In 2011, when those archaeologists took a closer look at the chapel, they found something else. Tiny traces of wax. Not from the kind of candles used in the Ottoman court, but from a different, older source, wax that was mixed with herbs, the exact kind of candles that nuns would have made back in their own convents. And what that means is that they kept their vigil, their silent protest, for far longer than anyone could have possibly imagined. For months, maybe even for years, they kept carving their crosses, whispering their prayers, and simply refusing to disappear. Sister Magdalena's little bird was the very last mark made on that wall. And right beside it, scratched so faintly it's almost a ghost on the stone, were two words in Greek: "We endure." But the truth of it is, they did so much more than just endure. They left something behind that even an empire couldn't erase. A hidden room filled with crosses, a desperate prayer carved into stone, the undeniable proof that faith, that the human spirit, could survive in a place where walls and chains were meant to break it. The Ottoman Empire itself lasted all the way until 1922. Sister Magdalena's little bird was the very last mark made on that wall. And right beside it, scratched so faintly it's almost a ghost on the stone, were two words in Greek: "We endure." But the truth of it is, they did so much more than just endure. 600 years of unbelievable conquest and absolute power, but in the end, it was those quiet scratches on a forgotten wall that survived. Not the Sultan's grand decrees, not Hassan Pasha's meticulous ledgers, not even the fine silk they dressed Sister Eleni in. Just 4 Latin words carved by women the world tried its best to forget. This story is about what happens when power tries to erase a people, and what happens when those people simply refuse to be erased. The Ottoman Empire stood for 600 years, a titan astride 3 continents, a force that redrew maps, silenced languages, and remade entire cultures, even turning the grandest cathedral in all of Christendom into a mosque. Their rule stretched from the gates of Vienna all the way to the sands of Arabia, and yet they could not break 18 women who did nothing more than scratch their prayers into cold, hard stone. Just think about that for a second. An empire armed with cannons and endless armies, driven by the will to reshape the very world, pitted against a handful of women with nothing left but their fingernails and their faith. And in the end, the women won. Though not in any way an empire would ever measure victory. They never reclaimed their convent, they didn't win over their captors, and they never, ever lived to taste freedom again. But they left a mark. You know, they say history is written by the victors, but memory is etched by the survivors. And sometimes, survival looks like a single cross, carved in the dead of night where no one on earth was ever supposed to see it. A prayer whispered in a language the conquerors fought to bury. A tiny bird scratched into the stone, a silent memorial for the sisters who had already fallen. And centuries later, against all odds, we found it anyway. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once wrote, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards." And these women, they lived forward, straight into an unending darkness. They walked for 7 days, knowing each step might be their last, and they crossed the sea bound in chains, knowing exactly what horrors waited for them on the other side. They descended into the tunnels beneath a palace, knowing they might never feel the sun on their skin again. But they carved their prayers anyway, holding on to the desperate trust that someone, someday, would look back in time and find them. And you just did. Back in 2011, as archaeologists stood in that hidden chapel, just staring at those crosses, one of them asked a question that, I gotta tell you, it still haunts me. How long did they keep this vigil? The faint traces of wax suggest it was for years, and the sheer depth of some of those carvings suggests a desperate, frantic, repeated effort, which means that these women gathered night after agonizing night, year after crushing year, in the absolute pitch black, dark, and simply refused to stop believing, even as sisters vanished, even as the number of scratches on the wall stopped growing, even when any sane person would say that all hope was long dead. They kept carving. My friend, that isn't just faith. That is defiance in its absolute purest form. The Ottoman Empire is gone now, dissolved into history back in 1922. Its sultans are nothing but dust, its mighty armies a distant memory, and while the palace still stands, it's just a museum now, where tourists walk the halls, snapping pictures, completely unaware of the sacred secret sleeping right beneath their feet. But those crosses are still there. And that Latin phrase, barely visible after 500 years, still whispers its truth. Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. It's from the Gospel of John, a verse about a light so profound it can never be extinguished, about a truth that survives even when everything else you've ever known has been stripped away. Sister Magdalena carved those words, knowing she would die in that palace, knowing her own name would be lost to the winds of time, knowing the world outside would just keep spinning on without her. But she carved them anyway, because she understood a fundamental truth that empires never, ever do. You can conquer land. You can rewrite the history books. You can strike names from ledgers, and you can bury bodies in unmarked graves. But you can never kill the fire that people carry inside their souls, and you can never, ever silence what they choose to carve into stone. You've just come face to face with one of history's most powerful secrets. If stories like this one remind you of just how fragile our humanity can be, how easily our voices can be silenced, then subscribe to Crimson Historians and help us keep the past alive. Because some voices deserve to be heard, even if they were silenced centuries ago. Especially then, the nuns of Street Catherine were meant to vanish. That was the entire plan. Erase them, break them, and turn them into ghosts or converts or just another footnote in some dusty Ottoman ledger. But they didn't disappear. They are still here, living in those crosses, breathing in that Latin phrase, dwelling in the hidden chapel that archaeologists stumbled upon 500 years too late. And now, they're here with you. Because you listened, because you remembered, because you refused to let their silence be the final word. Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not and will not overcome it.